The War Within Season 2 Mythic Plus updates ahead. All right, let's do a live react because I haven't had a chance to read this post yet. And so we're going to read this post together and kind of talk about some of the changes that they are making to Season 2 for Mythic Plus. Of course, we've seen some changes such as normalization of the affixes, where some of the Zaltas bargain affixes got normalized in terms of what their debuff was going to provide to the mobs. In addition to that, Oblivion got replaced in favor of Pulsar, but now I'm really interested in seeing what they're going to do differently for Season 2. I think that, changes to stops, maybe it seems like a lot of the dungeons have a difference in terms of how the stops are going to be functioning. It seems like, there's a decent amount fewer casters. Now, it's not that you never run into them, but it's very slight in terms of like the changes that you're seeing. And so I'm kind of interested in seeing what this post says about what's going to happen with Season 2 Mythic Plus updates. So it starts off by saying, over the course of War Within Season 1, the development team has received extensive feedback on Mythic Plus dungeons, of which revolved around frustrations, especially trying to progress through the system, primarily in pickup groups. Yeah, so pugs were feeling the burden of punishment pretty hard with a couple of key things like Challenger's Peril. Common areas of criticism have included the sense that players were faced with too many mechanics at once, that failure was too punishing, that rewards felt insufficient for the challenge and effort required, and that it could be hard for players to find groups as the community went towards the meta specs to help cope with these difficulties. I think that this is probably always going to be true. The community is going to gravitate towards meta specs to deal with anything, frankly. Of course, it depends on the level of how good a spec is and what's going on with that season in terms of like how required those specs are actually seen as. I would tend to agree, though, that players were faced with too many mechanics at once and failure was slightly too punishing. I don't know about rewards being insufficient for the challenge. I'll say insufficient for the challenge and effort. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but yeah, for some people, maybe it was true. We've already approached our Season 2 dungeon rollout on the PTR and ongoing teaming with an eye towards addressing mechanical issues. Cast times on critical enemy spells have been significantly increased. Tank damage spikes reduced in mitigation and or give it better telegraphs, and the overall number of threats in an average pack of enemies has been reduced and more. I think that's accurate. It's not something that's like... If you do the dungeons on the PTR, you are going to probably notice this. It's not something that is really, really apparent. It's not like they removed all of the threatening enemies, but it's a very slight change. And I would tend to agree that the cast time on critical spells has been significantly increased. Tank damage spikes, yeah, I mean, they changed this week how many tank busters were going to be in most of the dungeons. And a lot of the tank busters are actually going to be attached to bosses now. And hopefully they have better telegraphs. I mean, that's always tough, because telegraphing is pretty weird. And the overall number of threats in an average pack of enemies has been reduced. I think that that's also pretty accurate. Again, it's not that it's impossible, but a lot of the times you're seeing pretty much every single mob being deadly. I will say that one of the things that they didn't necessarily address here is the type of mob that I would describe as like an archer caster, where it will spam blank bolt. And if you have multiple of those go off at once, or multiple of those go off with an AoE effect, it can kill you pretty easily. While the cast time on critical enemy spells having been increased is actually a pretty good thing, and it helps your average player make sure they are actually able to get their interrupt. There's still these mobs, these archer mobs that cast lightning bolt, that are going to be pretty annoying. But I think that this is the fact that they're addressing this and they've identified the points of concern for a lot of players is promising for sure. We've also made improvements to rewards, especially reducing the penalty of failing to finish a dungeon within the timer in the Siren Isles content update, but we understood that there was still more to do in order to fully address the feedback we've been hearing. Now, as we approach the season, we have a chance to make some broader changes to the structure of Mythic Dungeon progression. So yeah, they're talking about amount of crests that you're actually gaining from a deplete versus a timed key. I think that was just like a warranted change, honestly. So yeah, no complaints there. The introduction of Dells have also significantly changed the in-game reward ecosystem. Players who were accustomed to doing Mythic Plus in the past expansions may have geared up in Dells at the start of War Within Season 1, then looked at Mythic Plus reward track and found few to no rewards worth their time below Mythic Plus level 7 or no. So this had two main effects. People would enter the system at Mythic Plus 7, Since they didn't need champion gear, 7 was the first level to drop hero items for each run. Often these players were just not ready for that level. Dealing with a 77% bonus to enemy health and damage on top of Challenger's Peril made deaths more costly. This was never designed to be an environment to learn mechanics for the first time, yet many players just ended up doing just that. Yeah, that was, and we talked about this on the podcast a lot. That was, I feel like, just like a miss. Like they talked about the on-ramp to Mythic Plus a couple of times in some of their posts, and this, I think, was like the biggest issue with the on-ramp, is that you, say you were a Delve guy, your initial foray into Mythic Plus was doing a 7, and you're like, it's like, hold on, you should not be in a 7 right now. Meanwhile, keys in the 2-6 range had a shallow application pool, especially the first few weeks of the season. This meant that players who tried to start at a lower difficulty in order to build the experience to succeed at +7 keys also had a hard time filling their groups and finding and experiencing many of the same frustrations. Yeah. Looking ahead to Season 2, our aim is to make Mythic Plus dungeon system more rewarding from the outset and smooth the difficulty progression so that each step feels approachable. To that end, we'll make the following changes. M0 dungeons will now reward champion track gear from each boss with a weekly instance lockout. The health and damage of these enemies in those dungeons has increased to reflect the improved rewards, while keeping M0 an accessible point of entry for players beginning their Season 2 gearing journey, and those looking to learn dungeons in a lower stakes environment. Okay. So it's going to be basically giving you Delve equivalent gear. Yeah, that's, again, whenever we were talking about like the on-ramp to Mythic Plus, I mean, I think that this is actually a pretty good way of starting to address that. From 2 through 10, each new level will now increase the health and damage of enemies by 7%, down from the previous 10%. First scaling will remain at 10% for 11 onwards. Yeah, I mean, this is gonna make the difficulty curve of 2 through 10 feel a lot easier, as opposed to really large dungeon level swings. Like once you start pushing up to a really high level, whenever you're getting this 10% per level scaling, it's actually really, really difficult to actually do +1 of a key. But for the 2 through 10 level, I don't think that that's necessary. I think that 7% is totally fine. This is going to actually end up being a huge thing cumulatively, especially if you're trying to push, like, you know, you're doing your 10, you're doing your weekly 10, and that's like, that's the peak of Mythic Plus for a lot of people, is just doing a weekly 10. And so I think that, you know, just this is actually a huge change, by the way, in terms of how difficult a 10 is necessarily going to be. Bargain affixes will move from 2 to 4, leaving no affixes other than the existence of a timer at the 2 entry levels of the M Plus system. Okay, so 2 and 3 are going to have just timer, no affixes. The alternating cycle of Tyrannical and Fortified will move up from 4 to replace the Challenger's Peril affix at 7, and the other one continuing to take effect at 10. At 12, instead of an additional 10% increase in enemy health, Xal'atath's Guile will now increase the... Oh, wow. Include the increased timer penalty for deaths that was formerly part of Challenger's Peril as a replacement for the rotating bargain affixes. While the mechanic could feel overly punishing for groups still learning and progressing towards gear rewards, as a focus on clean execution remains appropriate for the upper echelons of the system. Removing the extra 10% stats can make the transition to the prestige tiers feel like less of a wall. The requirements to achieve some key reward tiers have been reduced. Hero track gear is now available from end of run chests from 6s, and Gilded Crest from 7s and up. Yeah. So 12 still has the Guile? The Guile will now include the increased timer. Okay. I was just making sure that I was reading this correctly. At first, I thought that Guile was being replaced with Challenger's Peril at 12. But now it's just going to have the timer penalty on top of that. That's probably accurate for what it should be. So here's the thing. And I actually kind of agree with this. Whenever you're doing the upper echelons of the system, there is a level of execution that is just kind of expected for you to actually be able to time the key. For players who were just interacting with the system, the Challenger's Peril affix caught a lot of flack, especially for people who are just doing weekly 10s, like 7s, 8s, 9s. That crowd, they were not happy with the Challenger's Peril. If you're going above and beyond, and say we're doing 12s and we're pushing for rank 1 title, or we're pushing for the 2850 achievement, I guess would be the big thing now. Challenger's Peril is just fine. Like, you're not realistically going to time a key with a bunch of deaths anyways, especially once you start pushing. Now, removing this off the plus 10 will help. At least it's not going to make the dungeons necessarily easier, but it will allow people to perceive the dungeons as slightly easier as well, because they're no longer having that 15-second death penalty. And I think that this is what we're talking about whenever they were talking about pickup groups, talk about pugs early on in the season. You know, players do pug keys past 12, but more often than not, these are groups that are a little bit more coordinated in some capacity, and they kind of understand what they're getting themselves into. And so while you can pug a 10 now and not have the Challenger's Peril on it, this actually seems like these changes that Blizzard are looking to make, I'm going to say are pretty good for having a more gradual curve of difficulty. They're also changing Guile a little bit in terms of the 11 to 12 jump should, in theory, have fewer stats on the mobs, so it's not going to be this big jarring jump. That was something that they posted back a few weeks ago. One additional item of relevance to players in the upper end of the system, we're actually changing the rating required for the new Keystone Legend achievement being added in Season 2, moving from 2850 to 3000. Okay, so it's not just going to be... This being done to keep it a comparable key level of challenge and prestige. After the changes to ratings overall, we will be decoupling this achievement from the system that allows players to set a floor for their highest keystone levels. Okay, so this is staying. Instead, once a player has finished all 8 dungeons at Mythic plus 12 within the timer, their keystone will no longer automatically de-level below 12. Once a player has finished all timed dungeons on a 13, the new floor will be 13, and so on for all keys at or above level 12. Shit. Oh wow. Oh god, I have to take a second to think. So depletion is an important mechanic for the high end. And so depletion is an important mechanic for the high end for a couple of very specific reasons. It's mostly because you shouldn't be practicing that dungeon over and over again, because that's pretty obnoxious. More often than not, there's like 1 or 2 dungeons that are going to end up being like harder than the rest. Like say for this season, it's like Grim Batol. So more often than not, Grim Batol's like 1 or 2 key levels below like your max. So like right now, I would not be able to get a dungeon below a 17, which is like, looking at it like that, it's probably fine. There's probably some like weird boosting implications. Like this is like really good if you're playing with like a constant 5-man, or you have 5 people that are close to your skill. But if there's one odd man out, this is actually like an easier way of boosting. But I guess it doesn't really matter all too much. And they probably shouldn't design the system for players like that anyways. I think this is going to reduce the amount of homework keys just in general, and you can no longer banish your key to the Shadow Realms on accident because you depleted some 17 and now you have a 16. If you say you're my system, in my instance, you can no longer be like have your key banished to the Shadow Realms. This is probably just a pretty good change, just straight across the board. Yeah, wow. These are a lot of changes all at once. I'm really interested in seeing how it ends up feeling to play once we actually get into the system itself. Obviously, the PTR, like I've been seeing the dungeons, I've done all the testing on the PTR, so I've seen what the dungeons look like. And again, it's not like a massive change with what they're doing to the mobs, but it's a very slight change in terms of like the casters and the tank busters and stuff like that. So they're definitely trying to address it on a mob front. I'm really glad that Blizzard is addressing all this stuff, though. I feel like the fact that they're coming out and being like, yeah, these are the problems that people are having. These are the ways that we're going to try to address it. If it's not perfect, we're going to continue to try to reiterate on this in the future. I think that's great. But yeah, overall, I think I'm actually really excited for all of this stuff. I feel like I actually don't have any complaints about any of this realistically. The on-ramp was pretty bad for some of the players. I think that actually reworking and moving around a bunch of these affixes is going to be, again, better for the pickup group level of people. And then the Keystone Legends stuff with I think you're going to end up having to do 13s now for the mount, but having more rewards for the mount that's not just the rank 1 title. And then now changing how the de-leveling works once you're at the highest level, reducing the amount of homework keys that are going to have to be done on a weekly basis, in addition to the fact that you were already doing fewer homework keys as is because of how they've changed like the affix system, where every week is kind of push week. I think that this is going to be even better for the high-end community. But overall, I'm kind of interested in hearing your thoughts down in the comment section below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.